Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. The feared Russian Wagner army lands in Venezuela. I knew this was going to happen. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. World War III is here. Trump done bit off more than he can chew. Let's get to the content.
The situation in the northern part of Latin America continues to deteriorate rapidly. Everything that happens indicates that, very soon, another armed conflict may break out in this part of the world, this time between the United States and Venezuela. Indeed, under the pretext of fighting drug cartels, the United States has pulled quite large forces to the shores of Venezuela. At the same time, even pro-government American news sources admit that the so-called anti-drug operation of the United States is aimed at changing the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Furthermore, it is also worth noting that over the past 72 hours, the American strike group located off the coast of Venezuela was largely reinforced. The American senator from the Republican Party, Rick Scott, also added oil to the fire. In particular, on October 27, answering American journalists' questions from Fox News, Rick Scott bluntly stated that very soon, extraordinary events would take place in Venezuela, which would completely change the situation in the whole country. Furthermore, Rick Scott also advised the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, to pack up and flee to Russia or China before it is too late. Something is going to happen in the next few days or hours. Something extraordinary is about to happen in Venezuela. Whether it's internal or external factors. Yes, I'm sure something will happen that will completely change the situation in Venezuela. Honestly, if I were Maduro, I would be fleeing to Russia or China right now. Yes, his days are numbered, Senator Rick Scott said. Speaking to reporters, this high-ranking American politician also stressed that Nicolas Maduro is not only a dictator, but also the real leader of a drug cartel, who must be overthrown at all costs. Well, my dear truth-seekers, it is worth noting that in such threatening statements by this American senator, one can see the amazing self-confidence of all American authorities. For some reason, the American authorities believe that they have every right to do anything in all parts of our planet. That is why the threats of the American authorities against Caracas, and their interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela, are becoming more apparent with each passing day. For some reason, the American authorities are confident that they have every right to decide the fate of other countries. For some reason, the American authorities believe they have every right to determine what is best for citizens of other countries and what is worse. Well, my friends, these are the side effects of the unipolar world that was reborn after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I hope you understand why it is so important for all of humanity to have a balance of power and a multipolar world on the planet. And judging by what is happening in Latin America, Venezuela is preparing to become another battlefield, where Western globalists will try to take revenge for the defeat in Ukraine. So, a few hours ago, numerous sources in Caracas officially confirmed that the Venezuelan authorities are preparing for a full-scale war in the event of a U.S. invasion. Moreover, sources in the Pentagon were forced to admit that over the past 20 days, Venezuela, with the help of the Russian Federation, has significantly strengthened the air defense of Caracas, preparing not only for a ground operation by the U.S. Army, but also for massive American missile strikes. As it turned out, Venezuela deployed dozens of Russian Buk M2E anti-aircraft missile systems around Caracas and the vicinity of the capital, capable of hitting not only all types of aircraft, but also such complex and low-flying targets as Tomahawk cruise missiles. Furthermore, a few days ago, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro officially announced that 5,000 Russian Igleas complexes were deployed throughout the country, and that these systems would force the United States to pay a heavy price in the event of an attack on Venezuela. Indeed, satellite images from open sources and numerous statements by military experts indicate that the Venezuelan army has turned at least 3 strategic zones of the country into a real impregnable fortress. The coastal corridor of Caracas-La Guaira, the Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base in Caracas, and the hills on the western outskirts of the capital. It should be noted that the air defense systems located along the highway and coastal lines consist mainly of Russian transporter erector launcher and radar systems, also known as Teller modules. This means that Venezuela's air defense system functions as a single entity, which creates additional risks for the U.S. Army in the event of an invasion of the country. However, the problems for the United States did not end there. The fact is that on the morning of October 28, the Flight Radar 24 service made a statement that shocked White House officials. As it turned out, a few hours ago, a Russian IL-76TD aircraft landed in Caracas, with some secret cargo on board. At the same time, it is worth noting that this aircraft belongs to the air company Aviacon Cytotrans, which has been under U.S. sanctions for several years, due to its links with the Russian military department and the Russian private military company Wagner Group. Against this backdrop, many American experts expressed confidence that Russia has begun to deliver to Venezuela not only modern types of weapons, but also experienced fighters of the PMC Wagner Group, in case the United States decides on a ground operation. All this indicates that Russia has launched an operation to save Venezuela, amid a growing threat from the United States. By the way, many American experts expressed confidence that it was precisely because Russia interfered in the process of defending Venezuela that Washington postponed the attack on that country indefinitely. Most likely, the Pentagon is assessing all the risks of this operation and trying to avoid significant losses of personnel and equipment, especially considering Russia's military support for Caracas. Well, my dear friends, let's hope that China will also soon join Russia and begin to assist Caracas, as a result of which the Western globalists will suffer another humiliating defeat.
What if Venezuela used its Su-30 Mk2s against the United States? What if the roar of Russian engines echoed not over Donetsk, but across the Caribbean? What if Venezuela, armed with Moscow's Su-30 Mk2 strike jets, decided to turn a military exercise into a real confrontation against America's presence near its shores? That question no longer feels abstract. In recent weeks, Venezuelan pilots released live Fab 250 bombs during a national drill. Each blast a message wrapped in thunder. The display was more than symbolism. It was deterrence in motion, a declaration that Caracas still holds claws beneath the sanctions and rhetoric. And in Washington, the sound did not go unnoticed. The Su-30 Mk2 is no museum piece. It is the heaviest multi-role fighter in the Venezuelan inventory, designed for both maritime strike and deep interdiction. Twin AL-31F engines push it beyond Mach 2. 12 hardpoints carry up to 8,000 kilograms of weapons. And when those pylons hold Soviet-era Fab 250 bombs, each weighing 250 kilograms with 100 kilos of high explosive, the message is unmistakable. Venezuela still remembers how to strike. During the recent drills, the Fabs tore through practice targets with brutal simplicity. No precision guidance, no digital targeting pods, just raw kinetic power. Unguided bombs, yes, but in literal warfare, they are far from obsolete. One burst can create a runway, disable a depot, or scatter naval detachments along the coast. And when dropped in sequence, they turn open ground into a no man's land. Timing matters. The exercise came just as U.S. Navy and Marine aviation groups increased presence in Caribbean waters. It was a mirror held up to Washington, a reminder that power projection cuts both ways. Imagine this turning kinetic. Venezuelan Su-30 Mk2s lifting from El Libertador Air Base, skimming the horizon, loaded with Fab 250s and KH-29s. Targets? Maybe U.S. vessels cruising too close to Venezuelan waters. Maybe fuel depots on Caribbean islands used for American patrols. In theory, the Su-30s could reach them. In practice, the challenge would be immense. U.S. radar, airborne warning, and control system, and satellite constellations watch every meter of that airspace. The Venezuelan jets would be detected long before weapon release. F-22s or F-35s could intercept them before they even cross the line. And yet detection does not erase the signal. Even one Venezuelan aircraft breaking through, even one Fab 250 detonating near a U.S. asset would redraw red lines. Symbolically, it would echo Cuba, 1962, a reminder that America's hemisphere is no longer untouchable. Still, such a move would carry suicide-level risk. Venezuela's limited fleet could not sustain operations under U.S. retaliation. Its airfields would be targeted within hours. But in Caracas, that's not the point. Deterrence doesn't rely on victory, it relies on capability. The ability to make the other side think twice. Washington's answer would come fast and layered. Aegis destroyers patrolling the Caribbean can track a Su-30 the moment it climbs past the clouds. The Patriot and NASAM systems ring the southern bases with interceptors ready to launch at the first radar ping. Above, stealth predators circle unseen. The F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II define air dominance not just by speed, but by information. Their sensors would see, engage, and erase any Su-30 long before the Venezuelan pilot even locked a target. And beyond the visible fight, the electronic war would rage. American electronic warfare aircraft can jam radar, blind communications, and scramble navigation systems. Drone fleets would hover over Venezuelan runways, marking every aircraft movement in real time. In this equation, Venezuela's strike potential looks small but not meaningless. In warfare, perception matters. Even a limited counterpunch forces Washington to stretch its shield wider, to watch more skies. None of this happens in a vacuum. Behind every Venezuelan Sukhoi is a Russian blueprint and perhaps Russian technicians. Moscow's long support for Caracas extends beyond aircraft sales. It includes radar systems, missile integration, and intelligence links that could, in theory, turn Venezuela into a southern listening post. Russia's strategy is subtle but clear. If NATO presses near its borders, Moscow answers near America's. A Su-30 drill in the Caribbean may not change the battlefield, but it changes the psychology. Every Venezuelan sortie forces Washington to reckon with a new pressure point, one less predictable, one closer to home. Rumors of potential upgrades anti-ship missiles like the KH-31A, improved radar pods, or Russian instructors returning to maintain fleets. For Russia, this is a low-cost lever of influence. For the US, a warning that its strategic backyard is no longer uncontested. The Venezuelan drill was not a prelude to war. It was a theater with teeth. Every bomb dropped over that training range was aimed as much at Washington's perception as at any target. Caracas needed the world to see that its air force still flies, that its alliances still matter, and that sanctions have not grounded its will. For Venezuela, the symbolism works domestically too. It reinforces national pride and military morale. For Russia, it amplifies the story of multipolar resistance, the idea that US dominance is fading, challenged even within its own hemisphere. And for the United States, it's a reminder of how fast deterrence can shift. The sight of Russian-made fighters performing live bomb runs a few hundred miles from US shores is not a threat in itself, but it is a signal that the geopolitical map is changing color. If Venezuela ever crossed the line from drills to action, the clash would be short, fierce, and decisive. The US would prevail militarily, but the global narrative would shift. Moscow would gain proof that its influence reaches into America's sphere, and other nations would take note. That's why this standoff, symbolic though it seems, matters. The Fab 250s dropped in training are echoes of an older doctrine. Show power, don't use it unless forced. Venezuela's message is simple. We're still here, still armed, and not alone. The balance in the Caribbean now sits on perception, not payload. One wrong move, one misunderstood signal.
The U.S. will never defeat Venezuela. You heard it here first. Never.
And drills could turn into headlines the world isn't ready for. Because in the end, power projection isn't just about who has the better aircraft. It's about who controls the story when the engines fall silent. That's for today's episode. Thanks for watching.
Venezuela's National Assembly voted unanimously to approve a strategic partnership and cooperation treaty with Russia, a pact the government describes as a brotherhood that links the two nations in defense, energy, technology, mining and broader economic cooperation. The bill, presented by Deputy Roy Daza, was framed as a response to escalating U.S. pressure. Washington has recently struck 3 alleged drug smuggling boats, and President Donald Trump has warned that his administration is considering a land-based attack on drug cartels operating from Venezuela. The treaty, already signed by Presidents Vladimir Putin and Nicolás Maduro earlier in the year, now receives domestic legal backing, allowing Caracas to formalize arms purchases, joint oil and gas projects, technology transfers and joint military training. Lawmakers loyal to Maduro.
Now, one of our brothers was just asking about this treaty yesterday in the audience, so I looked into it, and yes, they just ratified this treaty. This strengthens what Russia is going to do to the U.S. if they attack Venezuela. Russia is going to send Venezuela all the advanced weapons they need to defeat the U.S., and this treaty makes it legal, and that's why the Russian cargo plane landed yesterday with all these advanced weapons and the men to work the advanced weapons.
Maduro hailed the vote as proof of Venezuela's sovereignty and a rejection of U.S. sanctions, calling the agreement a peace and multipolarity initiative that positions the country within a new international order. Implementation still requires presidential promulgation by Maduro. Once enacted, the accord is expected to expand joint activities that have already begun, including naval drills in the Caribbean, discussions on a possible nuclear energy collaboration, and new contracts for Russian firms to develop Venezuelan oil fields. For Russia, the treaty secures a strategic ally in Latin America, extending Moscow's influence in the Western Hemisphere at a time when it faces isolation over its war in Ukraine.
It's not isolated. That's a lie.
My friends, history is not written in silence. It is shouted through the roar of missiles and the collapse of empires. What we are witnessing today in Venezuela is not a headline, it is a signal that the old order, led by U.S. dominance, is trembling at its core. The world's balance of power is shifting, and once again, the empire finds itself challenged, this time not by words, but by the unmistakable presence of Russian missiles in Latin America. Venezuela's defiance did not erupt overnight. It has been brewing for years, built on layers of political humiliation, economic suffocation, and relentless U.S. pressure. What we are witnessing now is not merely a diplomatic shift or a military maneuver. It is the roar of a nation reclaiming its dignity. For too long, Washington viewed Venezuela as a failed experiment, a pawn on its geopolitical chessboard. But suddenly, that pawn has turned into a queen, moving strategically and unpredictably, backed by none other than Moscow's might. The move has caught Western analysts off guard. Yet for those who have studied the patterns of empire and resistance, this was inevitable. The turning point came when Caracas finally realized that economic survival and national sovereignty could no longer be separated. U.S. sanctions had crippled Venezuela's oil exports, the lifeblood of its economy. Inflation soared, industries collapsed, and the people suffered not just from economic mismanagement, but from calculated external strangulation. The U.S. believed that through economic isolation, it could engineer a regime change. But the policy backfired. It pushed Venezuela straight into the arms of America's most formidable rival, Russia. This defiance is not just political theater, it is deeply symbolic. When President Nicolas Maduro stood beside Russian officials welcoming military cooperation and missile defense systems, it was a declaration that Venezuela will no longer kneel to U.S. intimidation. The sight of Russian hardware arriving in a region long considered America's backyard sent shockwaves through Washington's establishment. The unspoken rule of the Monroe Doctrine that no rival power should operate in the Western Hemisphere had just been broken. The geopolitical chessboard shifted overnight. What makes this moment historically powerful is that Venezuela is not acting out of reckless ambition. It is acting out of necessity, driven by survival instincts and an understanding of global realignment. The world today is not the world of the 1990s, where U.S. power reigned unchallenged. We live in a multipolar environment where nations like Russia, China, and Iran offer economic and military alternatives to Washington's conditional aid and diplomatic coercion. Venezuela's defiance, therefore, is part of a larger pattern, a wave of nations refusing to be dictated to, no matter the cost. There's also an undeniable element of psychological warfare here. By aligning with Russia, Caracas is sending a loud message not just to the U.S. government, but to other Latin American states that have quietly suffered under the weight of American influence. It's saying you can resist, you can choose independence, and you won't be alone. This message resonates deeply across a continent with a long memory of U.S.-backed coups, interventions, and economic manipulation. Venezuela's defiance has reignited a dormant sense of regional solidarity, a collective reminder that sovereignty still has meaning, even in a world dominated by superpowers. The US media will frame this as provocation, as instability, as a reckless gamble by a desperate regime. But in truth, this defiance is an assertion of agency. It is Venezuela reclaiming its voice in a global dialogue that has long silenced it. The introduction of Russian missiles is not an act of aggression, it's a deterrent, a message that the era of unilateral military intimidation is coming to an end. For years, U.S. warships patrolled near Venezuelan waters with impunity, flexing power under the banner of freedom of navigation. Now, the equation has changed. Those warships may soon think twice before venturing too close. Beneath the military posturing lies a deeper narrative, one of economic rebellion. Venezuela's partnership with Russia extends beyond arms deals. It includes energy cooperation, technological exchange, and financial systems designed to bypass the US-dominated dollar trade. This is how resistance evolves in the 21st century, not through direct confrontation, but through economic innovation and strategic partnerships that undermine imperial leverage. Each missile, each trade agreement, each handshake between Caracas and Moscow chips away at the myth of American omnipotence. For the first time in decades, Latin America's voice echoes on the global stage, not as a subordinate, but as a challenger. Venezuela's defiance may be risky, it may be costly, but it is undeniably transformative. It has shattered the illusion of U.S. control and redefined what it means for a small nation to stand tall in a world of giants. The message is clear and electrifying. Sovereignty is no longer negotiable, and Venezuela will no longer bow to the empire's script. When the first reports surfaced that Russian missile systems were being deployed near Venezuela's coast, the global media erupted. But the deeper meaning of this move goes far beyond military hardware. It represents a tectonic shift in the balance of power, a calculated and deliberate challenge to U.S. naval supremacy in the Caribbean. For decades, the United States operated in this region with absolute impunity, its warships patrolling international waters as visible reminders of American dominance. But now, with Russian missiles positioned within striking range, that dominance faces a direct and unmistakable threat. The symbolism is as powerful as the weaponry itself. This is no longer America's uncontested ocean. The parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis are impossible to ignore. Yet this is not 1962. The geopolitical conditions have evolved, and so have the actors involved. Unlike Cuba during the Cold War, Venezuela's decision to host Russian weaponry is not born from ideological allegiance, but from strategic necessity. Decades of sanctions, economic siege, and diplomatic isolation have pushed Caracas to embrace any partnership that ensures its survival. For Russia, this deployment is a masterstroke, an opportunity to project power into Washington's own neighborhood while sending a clear message. The age of unilateral American control is over. The missiles themselves, whether defensive systems like the S-400 or offensive cruise variants, are not just tools of deterrence. They are political instruments reshaping perceptions of vulnerability. The U.S. Navy, long accustomed to operating freely near Latin American shores, now faces a sobering new reality. Any aggressive maneuver could be met with an equal and opposite show of force. The Caribbean, once considered a safe staging ground for U.S. power projection, has become contested space. Every radar ping, every naval exercise, every satellite image now carries new weight. Inside Washington, this move has triggered quiet panic. Military planners and policymakers are confronting a nightmare scenario. a hostile alliance taking root within the Western Hemisphere, undermining the Monroe Doctrine's unspoken promise that the Americas would remain under U.S. influence. The irony is bitter. While American officials accused Moscow of escalation, it was Washington's own policies that paved the way. Years of economic warfare against Venezuela, relentless attempts to isolate Russia, and the expansion of NATO toward Moscow's borders have collectively produced the very alliance the U.S. now fears. For Russia, the deployment serves multiple purposes. It allows Moscow to demonstrate that U.S. pressure can and will be reciprocated. When NATO missiles appear in Eastern Europe or near Russia's borders, the Kremlin can now respond in kind, positioning its technology within reach of U.S. assets. This symmetry redefines deterrence in a multipolar age. Moreover, it sends a signal to Russia's allies and potential partners. Moscow is not merely a regional power, it is a global actor capable of shaping outcomes anywhere on the map. For countries under U.S. sanctions, this is more than symbolic, it's a promise of protection. The visual impact is undeniable. Russian missile launchers on Venezuelan soil, naval technicians working alongside local military officers, and radar stations scanning the horizon. All of it conveys defiance, confidence, and control. It transforms Venezuela's image from a struggling, isolated state into a frontline player in a broader geopolitical struggle. And for millions across Latin America, long accustomed to seeing their region as a passive stage for U.S. operations, it ignites a new sense of possibility that even the most powerful empire can be challenged when alliances are built on mutual interest instead of subservience. The U.S. response so far has been cautious but tense. Diplomatic warnings, intelligence assessments, and veiled threats have filled official statements, yet there is an underlying recognition that direct military confrontation would be disastrous. The American public, wary from years of foreign wars, would not support another escalation, especially one so close to home. Meanwhile, global audiences are watching closely. In Moscow and Beijing, policymakers see vindication. In Washington, strategists see exposure. Beyond the hardware and strategy lies a deeper transformation, the psychological impact of vulnerability. For generations, the U.S. projected power outward, never fearing retaliation within its sphere of influence. That illusion has now shattered. Each missile, each radar installation on Venezuelan soil is a reminder that U.S. dominance can be mirrored, that intimidation can flow both ways. The Caribbean, once the quiet periphery of American might, has become a flashpoint in the unfolding drama of multipolar power. The deployment of Russian missiles in Venezuela marks more than a military event. It is a declaration of equality in defiance. It says to Washington, your monopoly on force is over. It says to the world, the game has changed. This is geopolitical theater at its most intense, where symbolism and strategy collide, and where a small nation, long dismissed as irrelevant, now stands as the stage upon which global power recalibrates itself. The echo of this moment will travel far beyond the Caribbean. It will reverberate through every capital where nations question whether the old empire still holds the right to command the world. The concept of American power has long rested on the belief that the United States can project strength across every continent, on land, sea, and air, simultaneously and indefinitely. Yet today, that belief is being tested as never before. The empire that once moved with precision and authority now shows visible strain. Every front, from Europe to the Middle East to the Pacific, demands its attention, its resources, and its credibility. The global overstretch of U.S. power has become not just a military challenge, but a political and moral one. It is the inevitable fatigue of a superpower that has tried to dominate too much for too long without recalibrating its purpose. The cracks are everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the prolonged conflict in Ukraine has drained Washington's strategic bandwidth. Billions of dollars flow into a war with no clear endgame, while domestic infrastructure crumbles and political divisions deepen at home. Across the Pacific, U.S. naval fleets maneuver through the South China Sea, trying to contain Beijing's rise. But the reality is inescapable. China's economic and military capacity has surpassed the point where it can be contained. In the Middle East, a new wave of instability has erupted as alliances shift. Oil routes are threatened, and Washington's traditional partners question the value of its promises. Every region now demands more than the U.S. can realistically provide. This overstretch is not just military, it's economic. The American dollar, long the cornerstone of global trade, faces mounting challenges from BRICS nations building alternative financial systems. Sanctions, once a weapon of coercion, have lost much of their bite as nations find creative ways to trade outside the U.S. banking structure. The very tools of dominance, military bases, sanctions, aid conditions, are now weakening from overuse. The United States, once the undisputed conductor of global affairs, is increasingly reacting instead of leading, chasing crises it can no longer control. The deeper danger lies in perception. Across the world, nations are watching the United States struggle to sustain multiple conflicts and commitments, and they are drawing conclusions. They see a superpower that can no longer impose its will without resistance, a power that relies more on memory than on momentum. The aura of invincibility that defined post-Cold War America has faded. Each new confrontation exposes not dominance, but dependence on borrowed money, on private contractors, on alliances that grow more fragile with every misstep. Venezuela's defiance and Russia's presence in the Caribbean are not isolated provocations. They are symptoms of this overstretch. When Washington threatens sanctions or military retaliation, its words no longer carry the same deterrent weight. The world has learned that the U.S. cannot be everywhere at once, that its attention is finite, and that its political system is paralyzed by partisanship. This awareness emboldens others to act, to test boundaries, to push back where they once would have yielded. The empire's greatest weakness, ironically, is its own exhaustion. Inside the Pentagon, strategists speak of readiness and resilience, but behind the technical language lies a deeper anxiety. The United States must now balance deterrence in Europe, reassurance in Asia, and crisis management in the Middle East, all while maintaining domestic political legitimacy. It is a juggling act no empire in history has sustained for long. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, each fell not from invasion, but from the slow erosion of capacity, overextension, and internal decay. History whispers its warning, but Washington seems deaf to the sound. The political consequences are equally profound as voters grow weary of endless wars and trillion-dollar defense budgets. Domestic priorities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure remain underfunded. The American public is questioning why its prosperity must be sacrificed for distant conflicts. Every foreign intervention now faces growing skepticism. Every military budget faces sharper scrutiny. The once united front of American globalism is fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. What makes this moment historic is that the overstretch is not temporary, it is structural. The United States built a system of global control dependent on perpetual expansion, but the world has changed. Emerging powers are asserting their autonomy. Technology is redistributing influence, and information flows have eroded propaganda monopolies. America's military might still dwarfs that of any single rival, but combined, the new coalition of nations, Russia, China, Iran, and their allies, creates a strategic complexity that no amount of hardware can solve. The overstretch is, in essence, the story of an empire facing its limits. It is the fatigue of a power that mistook dominance for destiny, that believed control could substitute for cooperation. The United States remains powerful, but no longer unchallenged. Every new crisis, from the Ukrainian front to the Caribbean waters, reveals a nation fighting on too many fronts with too little coherence. The question is no longer whether the U.S. can respond. It's how long it can sustain the illusion that it can respond to everything. The world is shifting, and even the mightiest empire cannot hold the center forever. The 21st century is no longer defined by a single center of power. It is an unfolding contest among several. What we are seeing today is not just a shift in alliances or a new round of diplomatic posturing. It is the birth of a multipolar world, a fundamental restructuring of global order. The United States, once the uncontested hegemon, now faces rivals that do not merely challenge its dominance, they rewrite the rules entirely. The emergence of this new system has been gradual, yet unstoppable, driven by a shared determination among nations to end the era of unilateral control. The voices once silenced by economic pressure and military intimidation are beginning to speak in unison, crafting a global chorus of independence. At the heart of this transformation lies a new understanding of power. No longer is power measured solely by military strength or nuclear stockpiles. It now resides in economic connectivity, technological innovation, and the ability to forge genuine partnerships. The rise of China as a global economic giant, the resurgence of Russia as a military and energy power, and the growing assertiveness of regional blocs like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization all point to one undeniable truth. The world is no longer willing to orbit around Washington's axis. Each of these players brings its own model of influence, its own vision for global cooperation. And together they are constructing a counterbalance to Western dominance that is both sophisticated and strategic. The recent alliances forming across continents are more than mere tactical moves. They are declarations of intent. When Venezuela partners with Russia, when Iran deepens its ties with China, when African nations sign trade deals that bypass the US dollar, they are not just conducting business, they are engaging in a quiet revolution against the existing world order. The language of compliance is being replaced by the language of sovereignty. Nations long dismissed as developing or unstable are now key architects of a new financial and political architecture designed to redistribute power more evenly. This is not chaos, it is evolution. The US and its allies, accustomed to controlling the narrative, now find themselves reacting to a global shift they can no longer dictate. Sanctions that once crippled economies are losing their potency as alternative financial systems emerge. Trade once monopolized by Western institutions is being rerouted through new corridors that connect Asia, Africa, and Latin America directly. The creation of BRICS financial mechanisms, the expansion of digital currencies, and the integration of energy cooperation agreements are all pieces of a larger mosaic, a world where no single power can dominate the flow of capital, information, or influence. The Western media frames this as fragmentation, as if the decline of US dominance automatically means disorder. But in reality, it reflects a more balanced global reality. Nations are simply reclaiming what globalization promised but never delivered: mutual respect and self-determination. The rise of multipolarity does not mean the fall of America. It means the end of America's monopoly on decision making. The shift is profound because it undermines the ideological foundation of Western supremacy, the belief that liberal capitalism backed by US Military power represents the only path to progress. The rest of the world has seen that model falter under debt crisis, endless wars, and political dysfunction, and it is now choosing its own way forward. The psychological impact of this new order cannot be overstated. For decades, the global South looked to Washington, London, or Brussels for approval and aid. Today, it looks to Beijing, Moscow, or Delhi for partnership. This psychological independence is as revolutionary as any military development. It marks a turning point where nations are no longer defined by dependency, but by strategic self-interest. The result is a web of interconnections that makes unilateral action nearly impossible. Every move now carries global consequences. Every decision requires dialogue rather than decree. In this new world, power is distributed, not concentrated. The United States remains influential, but it is now one voice among many. The old empire's authority has been replaced by negotiation, and even coercion must wear the mask of cooperation. The more Washington resists this reality, the more isolated it becomes. Meanwhile, multipolarity opens opportunities for smaller nations to shape regional policies, leverage resources, and assert their interests without fear of domination. The world is no longer watching the superpowers dictate the story, it is writing its own narrative. This birth of a multipolar world is not without tension, but it carries an undeniable energy, a sense that history is being rewritten in real time. The alliances forming today will define the next century. The United States may still possess unmatched firepower, but the moral and strategic gravity of the world is shifting elsewhere. The global stage no longer has a single spotlight, it has many. And under each of those lights, nations once dismissed as peripheral are stepping forward, ready to take their place in the new script of global power. The age of one empire's command is fading. The age of shared influence has begun, whether the old order accepts it or not. Empires fall not when they are defeated, but when they are denied obedience. And tonight, Venezuela just said no to empire loudly, clearly, and with missiles pointed at the sky.
American, or maybe even not an American, to find out what the truth is. Hey, everybody, this is Jay Speak. I'm Rick Sanchez. I'm in Turkey right now, interestingly enough. What a beautiful country. But I want to talk to you about Venezuela because there's something you and I have to do as citizens of the world, and more importantly, if we happen to be, like in my case, citizens of the United States. Right now, there are some 10,000 U.S. fighting men and women off the coast of Venezuela, 10,000 soldiers who are seemingly being told that they might be on the brink of invading this country, Venezuela. There are warships, including a U.S. submarine off the coast of Venezuela. So this is where, if we are truly a democracy, it's your job, if you happen to be an American, or maybe even not an American, to find out what the truth is, right? Do things match up? So the U.S. government is saying, right, that the Venezuelans are complicit, that they're working with drug cartels, that they're directly involved with the drugs that are being pushed into the United States, that they are doing this on purpose, and that the government, specifically the president Maduro, has to be removed so we can put somebody else in there who will not allow that to happen. So that is basically what our government is telling us. Now, before there's one drop of blood spilled by an American in Venezuela, or another, $10 billion spent from your tax money, it's your job to find out, is this true? Because we obviously didn't ask the right questions in Vietnam. We didn't ask the right questions going back to Korea. We certainly didn't ask the right questions in Iraq. So we cannot once again allow our government, right, to start a war and spend our money, our treasure, our blood, our children's blood on a lie. So is this a lie? Simple, right? That's what I have to do. I claim to be a journalist. Well, then, damn it, be a journalist, right? So over the last couple of days, even late last night, I woke up and I started thinking about this. I said, we have to make sure this doesn't happen. I had a conversation with Max Blumenthal. I think Max Blumenthal is one of the smartest guys in the world. I'm going to play some of Max Blumenthal for you, by the way, his take on this as well. He just had a conversation with a guy named Jordan Gaudreau. Jordan Gaudreau is hired by the CIA and the Trump administration, the previous Trump administration, to go to Venezuela and remove Maduro and somehow create a coup in the government so that they can be replaced with people who are more favorable to U.S. multinational corporations in the United States so they can make more money off of the hydrocarbons that are in Venezuela and the resources of Venezuela. According to Max, even the gold in Venezuela. My God, it sounds like we've gone back 100 years. But let's go back to the question. This is what you and I need to talk about. So, U.S. government says this. Is that true? Right? They say the Venezuelan government is involved in drug trafficking, blah, 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 blah. Is there truth in that? Or is this a story being made up, a fabrication, if you will, so that the United States can get its way for the sake of some very rich assholes who will make a ton of money off of Venezuela, like a lot of rich assholes made a lot of money off of the war lie in Iraq? Okay, let's do this. I looked it up. I started doing some research, and here's what I have found. Let me take you through it. First, I went to the Washington Office on Latin America. It's called WOLA. It's an agency that puts out information. And what I did was I started looking at all the information that was put out by all the major organizations and agencies prior to the Trump administration making these accusations about Venezuela. In other words, I wanted to see what they were saying before we were being told this. And here's what I found. WOLA says Venezuela, in their annual report of 2024, Venezuela is not a transit country for U.S. bound drugs or cocaine. Not. WOLA. DEA. I went to see what the DEA has been saying about Venezuela. This is their, according to the DEA threat assessment for 2024, there's not even a mention of Venezuela as an international threat assessment to U.S. citizens. Huh? So in 2024, it wasn't even mentioned, but all of a sudden in 2025, it is the biggest threat to U.S. citizens, and we have to send submarines and 10,000 soldiers to go there and fight because of something that didn't even exist in 2024. You seeing a pattern here? You seeing what I'm seeing? Let's go to the National Intel Council. This is the Intelligence Council of the United States. It says, or finds, Maduro does not control drug trafficking in this portion of Latin America. Wait, we're being told that Maduro does control drug trafficking. So I'm looking at the agencies that put out the necessary information regarding Venezuela and drug trafficking, and all of them in 2024 were telling me, no, Venezuela is not like Ecuador. Venezuela is not like Mexico. Venezuela's drug cartels Cartel de Sol and Tren de Aragua are yes, problematic criminal organizations, but in comparison to the big cartels in other parts of the world, they're relatively small. So wait, again, this is not matching up, right? What else did they find? According to the NIC, Venezuela has no role in the production and or export of synthetic drugs to the United States, including fentanyl or opium derivatives. So Venezuela is not involved in fentanyl production. They're not exporting it into the United States. This is the National Intelligence Council, and nothing to do with opium, for example. Well, that's a hell of a thing, because my government's now telling me that it's completely the opposite, right? And you know what's almost ironic about this? You know which country has been responsible for the transport and development of opium in the world? The United States. So if you really think about it, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you this because most of you guys who watch my podcast are pretty smart. So when the United States controlled Afghanistan, opium production out of the poppy fields of Afghanistan increased about 10 or 20 fold. So in other words, when we were in charge of Afghanistan, the heroin, the opium production, the opioids that were being created in Afghanistan went up 10, 20 fold. And as soon as we left Afghanistan, the new government of Afghanistan got rid of the poppy fields and stopped the production of opium. So does that mean we were involved in the trafficking of opium and opium production? You bet your ass we were, at least unless you're blind and you can't see the actual stats. So maybe if we need to invade a country, what, do we invade ourselves? If we want to find a country that was actually systematically involved in the production of drugs to be distributed throughout the world and that eventually came to Americans and got Americans high? I mean, these are the facts, Jack. These are the facts. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do this. So, and let me introduce Max. Let me let you get Max's take on this, because I called Max because, again, Max had just done an interview with a guy named Jordan Gaudreau. Jordan Gaudreau told him he was hired by the CIA and really bad people inside the Trump White House, not this Trump White House, the previous Trump White House, the Boltons of the world, had hired this guy Gaudreau to go to Venezuela and overthrow the government. And he takes Max through the story. It's a fascinating case. You can look it up. But here's Max talking about what can only be described as pure fucking greed being the reason for what we seem to be seeing taking place right now in Venezuela. Here's Max's take.
I was fascinated by Mr. Gaudreau. I really was. And I think he generally seems to be telling the truth. And you were pushing him, and he was kind of nervous and scared throughout the entire interview. Is he telling the truth about this coup that he tried to pull off?
Well, unless the discovery documents that he acquired through being prosecuted by the U.S. government are fabricated, then he is telling the truth, and that this goes much higher than we realized. And I think if we look at what the Trump administration is doing now, not just in Venezuela, but in Greenland, in Congo, in Pakistan, and I'll explain why those areas are relevant here. It's a straight up resource grab in Venezuela. And that's why Jordan Gaudreau was initially recruited by this group, Global Governments, which was run by Trump's body man, one of the closest people to Donald Trump, someone who might not be that well known to the public, but who is extremely influential right now, named Keith Schiller. So we have all the names of influential people in the Trump organization, what you could kind of call a Trump regime. And they're all over these documents. what wound up happening was an embarrassingly failed coup, which left Jordan Goudreau hung out to dry. And so they all have plausible deniability right now. But now they're going for the same thing with the U.S. Navy on a massive deployment. And once again, they're all vying for contracts in the day after in a post-Maduro Venezuela. So what we have here with Operation Gideon, which was the plot that Jordan Goudreau enacted, which is now mocked as the Bay of Piglets, the stupid Bay of Pigs, and started out as Operation Edgemont, was sort of a pilot program for what Marco Rubio is attempting right now.
He actually says at one point, the plan is to take out Maduro, and that way we can monetize his assets. I mean, how disgusting. How much more plain can he be about what the intent of this was? Sounds like just pure greed based on lies.
Yeah, I mentioned Keith Schiller. He was the Trump body man, sort of played bodyguard, but was also sort of a private liaison who had an arms export control license. He was one of the initial figures in making this deal to secure someone like Jordan Goudreau, who was a special forces or former U.S. Green Beret, as the kind of muscle. They believed that they had consolidated a force close to Nicolas Maduro within the military that would flip, and that it would be easy for them to secure some kind of coup. And they were working within the Venezuelan opposition with two figures, Jorge Betancourt and Lester Toledo, who Jordan, I think, correctly identified as CIA assets. Lester Toledo is now an advisor to Nayib Bukele, the Salvadoran president. And these were the key guys who then folded this operation into a formal contract signed by Juan Guaido, recognized as the president of Venezuela by the U.S., and J.J. Rendon, the top political consultant in Venezuela, to actually kidnap Nicolas Maduro and extricate him out of Venezuela in exchange for a $10 million performance bonus. I mean, this was a formal contract. But going back to Keith Schiller and this global governments group, yes, the openly stated objective was to steal Venezuela's resources by removing this kind of nationalist government of Nicolas Maduro and installing someone like Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel War Prize winner, who has openly promised in an interview with Donald Trump Jr. to hand over lucrative contracts to Trump Incorporated. And where is Keith Schiller right now? He's a lobbyist for Pakistan to negotiate rare earth mineral deals with the Trump organization. And he's been in and out of Greenland with his new company called GreenMet to attempt to plunder Greenland's rich mineral resources out from under the government of Denmark, which controls Greenland. So it's really obvious what's going on and what Trump Incorporated is about, which is to use the U.S. military or private operators, mercenaries, in order to enrich themselves. And I guess as U.S. taxpayers, we're kind of footing the bill and paying the price of the backlash, which, if there is a regime change in Venezuela through an invasion, would be another massive migration wave.
I think Max is one of the best news gatherers in the world right now. And I say that interestingly enough because in the last 24 hours, I've been looking at some of the corporate media, and you know that thing we learned from our parents, hopefully from your mom, my mom, your dad, my dad, right? And they used to say to me, and I'm sure they said to you too, tell me who you hang around with and I'll tell you who you are. Yeah. So I was just watching some of the different, Sunday morning shows and some of the other cable news shows, and you know who they're interviewing? Instead of looking at the facts like I just did, which by the way, it took me an hour and a half maybe of researching different agencies and looking at their reports, what I just read to you. Instead, you know how they're getting their information? They're interviewing U.S. senators. Most of them are in a bag and corrupt as hell. And they're interviewing other people who are part of these multinational agencies who are going to make buku bucks off of this invasion of Venezuela. They're interviewing people in the military industrial complex. Hell, I just saw CBS, you know who CBS's go-to guy is? Lindsey Graham. It's like, Lindsey Graham. Oh, yeah. If you want the truth, make sure you call Lindsey Graham to find out what's going on, because you know Lady Lindsey will tell you exactly what's happening. Gosh, it's shameful. But, you know, you don't have to be a genius to figure this stuff out, man. I've been, because my dad taught me since I was a little boy that things are not always as they seem when it comes to U.S. Interventions and U.S. politics, geopolitics in particular, in Latin America, because I was born in Cuba. And my dad was a poor guy who, God bless him, but loved the United States and believed in the United States, but also was willing to call the United States out for its faults. And unlike many Cubans in Miami who are like, oh yeah, you know, comunismo, and they vote for people based on how many wars they can start. My dad was very different in that sense, and he had a more humanistic approach. And because he kind of grew up as a peasant with a fourth grade education, he taught me to always think of the little guy. And if you think of the little guy and you look at the history of Latin America, you pretty much find out right away. And Max and I are going to talk about this in a minute, that this is nothing new. History of the United States and its involvement in Latin America is replete with these kinds of things. And it's happened in country after country after country. Maybe the best example, and if you're bored and you want to look it up and you have nothing to do, go to Google. Well, be careful with Google, by the way, but look at some research. Yeah, Google's compromised. God, so is like Wikipedia. Disgusting. But go look up Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz. He was a decent man who was elected the president of Guatemala in the 1950s by the Guatemalan people. And as soon as he mentioned that he wanted to do some land reforms and maybe give more power to the people, the CIA and the United States and the United Fruit Company found out about it, and they went in and had him removed, started a coup, which led to a civil war. We paid off the corrupt generals to take over the government. That civil war ended up in the deaths of like 200,000 Guatemalans. And Guatemala is kind of a partially owned satellite of the United States to this day because of that. But at the expense of 200,000 people. Nice. Huh? Yeah, it's a good one to look up because it's and I just mentioned the 1954 Guatemala Arbenz case, and who was democratically elected. And we go in and we take him out because his people liked him, but we didn't. Is it our job to go around deciding who we like and don't like, or is it the people of those countries' job to figure out who they want to be led by, even if they pick a loser, right? It's their job to figure it out, not our job to go in and impose our will. But this has happened over and over and over again. I had this conversation with Max as well. Here's Max's take on the precedent for what we may be seeing right now in Venezuela.
Those of us from Latin America know that this is an old story. The United States has been doing this for the past 100 years. It just seems curious to me that they would be so blatant in this example to just go in there and take out the old playbook and try and play it again. And by the way, they've been doing this for a long, long time in Venezuela. This is not the first failed coup. They keep trying and trying to take out people who were democratically elected, whether we like them or not, whether we like Chavez or we like Maduro. Their people elected them, and they should stay in office until they're removed democratically. No? Am I crazy?
Well, I mean, even if it wasn't democratic, there's nothing that's more undemocratic than a foreign government marching into a country, toppling its government, stealing its resources, impoverishing its people, and then just simply leaving them with whatever puppet leadership was installed. And that's what happened throughout the banana wars that you're referring to in Latin America. I mean, read the memoirs of Smedley Butler, the U.S. Marine, who said, I was basically the muscle for a gigantic business cartel. The U.S. Marines marched into Port-au-Prince in Haiti and stole Haiti's gold. They stormed into Nicaragua to steal the country and Guatemala to steal those countries' land on behalf of the United Fruit Company. And Smedley Butler woke up and realized that he was basically being used by something that had nothing to do with the United States people, the American people or American democracy. He was just enriching a bunch of oligarchs with top hats. And Jordan Goudreau is kind of playing the same role. I don't know if he has the same awareness, but he's one of many figures who are vying to kind of be the cowboy hero, storming into Caracas, being welcomed as liberators, and realizing the people didn't actually want them there. His fellow U.S. Green Berets and a few Venezuelan rebels who'd been camped out in the Colombian jungles were actually captured by Guaprativos, fishermen on the coast of Venezuela, and easily arrested, and they were sold out. But why did they go in? It was ultimately because the Trump administration organized this $15 million bounty on the head of Nicolas Maduro, and they've now raised it to, I think, $50 million, which is the same bounty that was over the head of Osama bin Laden. What they're doing with that bounty is they're trying to entice people, whether it's Jordan Goudreau or Eric Prince from the former Blackwater Company Academy, who controls an entire training base in North Carolina called Camp Moyac. And there was a prospectus in the discovery documents that Jordan Goudreau got for 500 mercenaries to train at Eric Prince's base to go into Venezuela. So they're trying to get as many private operators to go in as possible to terrorize Venezuela. And this keeps happening. I mean, in 2018, Nicolas Maduro was nearly assassinated in a Colombian intelligence operation through a drone at a military parade. You can watch the video of that. I interviewed Nicolas Maduro months afterwards, and he directly blamed John Bolton. Well, guess what? Jordan Goudreau said that John Bolton was operating behind the scenes here in attempting to influence these kinds of coups. And what Trump is doing is, even as he's arresting or indicting John Bolton, is like Bolton's fantasy on steroids.
You know, it's interesting talking to Max, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So here's something else Max said that I think is very fascinating that I want you to maybe get an understanding of, because I hadn't heard it quite put this way. And it seems crazy, but Max seems to be convinced, based on the research he does and the people he talks to. One of the best things about Max Blumenthal are his sources who take him through these kinds of explanations. And what he's talking about now is, you know, the good old-fashioned domino effect that some of us remember, or our grandparents or our parents lived through in the 1940s and 50s after World War II, where we just went around basically saying we have to invade or take out a government or remove or start a war somewhere because of the domino effect. It's like, well, we don't like their government, and we fear that if we allow that government, then the government next door will be like that government, and bad will be followed by more bad and more bad. And you know, it's a ridiculous concept that basically says you then have the right to remove anybody anywhere based on the principle of, if I don't like them, I fear others might. And if others might, then they'll do the same as that. And then we, instead of having one president or one leader in one country we don't like, we could have 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. It's crazy. I mean, it goes beyond the Platt Amendment and the Monroe Document, at least in Latin America, that says, oh, we're responsible for the governments of all those countries. No, we're not. But with the domino theory, it's even worse, because it gives the United States the outright excuse for going in and changing governments, even if they haven't done anything wrong, just because we think they might. And then they might influence the other country next to them, to the left of them or to the right of them. Oh my God. It's obviously a bullshit reason, but it's been used in the past. And according to Max, it's kind of the thing that's being discussed now. He says in this case, it's not just Venezuela, but it's Cuba, Nicaragua, and Colombia. So is the United States getting ready to go into Venezuela and Colombia and Nicaragua and Cuba? That's a hell of a thing. Here's Max.
Well, you know, those people you're talking about in Miami, unfortunately, those are my people. And, you know, as you often say about some Jewish Americans who seem to be more intent on backing the government of Israel than the government of the United States, we almost have to like say, forgive them, for they know not what they do, but they're caught up in this whole thing. And they never stop to think about the consequences or what the actual actions are behind this, because they're just in on it. You know, Venezuelans have just learned a hard lesson. I mean, they went out and supported Trump, voted for Trump, backed Trump, gave money to his campaign, and now he's pretty much pooping on them. You know what I mean?
It's the definition of a fifth column. They're, you know, using these elements are using the United States government as a vehicle for settling scores in other countries, and members of the U.S. military are expected to fight and die for these foreign causes and foreign intrigues. And I think a large part of the American public's waking up to it. Younger Republicans or younger people on the right, I guess you could call them conservatives, are waking up to this issue, and there's no support for this among younger progressives. But I also noticed an interesting trend among younger Cuban Americans, which is that they actually liked normalization with Cuba because it was easier for them to go back and visit their families and go to this country. And, you know, they hadn't lived through the Bay of Pigs and all of these other intrigues. And I think, you know, they would want a more peaceful, harmonious relationship with Cuba. But Venezuela and the regime change operation there is intended, from Marco Rubio's perspective, to have a ricochet effect. From Rubio's point of view, it's purely ideological. It's all about Doral and South Florida. He wants to destroy the engine that has sustained the Cuban Revolution as the U.S. embargo tightens, and that's Venezuela. So once they're done with Venezuela, they're going to move to Cuba. They're going to move to Nicaragua, which has a socialist-oriented nationalist government, which is actually very popular inside Nicaragua. And Trump is now threatening Nicaragua with 100% tariffs, which will have the usual effect of causing a migration wave from a country that has not had many migrants to the U.S. You don't meet a lot of Nicaraguans around the U.S. If they go to work, you know, labor jobs, they'll go to Costa Rica. So this is another disaster in the waiting, and it has to stop at Venezuela with some sanity. And that means the U.S. people need to demand that their members of Congress actually vote on this. And U.S. journalists need to start researching and filing FOIA requests on what the U.S. is doing in the Caribbean, and ask tough questions, which are not possible at the Pentagon, because the Pentagon has imposed new censorship rules, which resemble those of the supposed authoritarian countries the U.S. constantly denounces.
Now I want to talk about something that I think is so important based on the need for us to understand. Let me start this one again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, now I want to talk about something that's really, really important, which cuts against everything that the Trump administration stands for. This is such a fucking paradox. Think about this for a minute. What will happen if what Max describes takes place? What if we were to invade or create a conflagration, if you will, light things up in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and who am I missing? Colombia. What do you think will happen? Let me tell you what will happen. What is the one thing the Trump administration is most against and got elected for? Correct. Controlling immigration in the United States, making sure America is for Americans. not for people coming here. What do you think will happen if we do this in those 4 countries? Just the opposite. The number of people who will come to the United States will be at least 5-fold increase in immigration to the United States from those countries. Every single time we unsettle a country, why do you think there are so many Guatemalans in the United States? Do you think Guatemalans hate their country and want to come here inherently? No. Guatemalans would love nothing more than to stay in Guatemala. Cubans would have loved nothing more than to stay in Cuba. Venezuelans would have loved nothing more than to stay in Venezuela. All the people who leave their countries, right, would love to stay in their countries. But when conditions become such that they can't stay in those countries, most often because Western countries have gone in there, whether it's Syria or Libya or Cuba, or most recently in Latin America and the history of Latin America, or just in the last 20 years, Venezuela, because the United States has enacted policies to destroy and coups to destroy Venezuela, therefore making it impossible for people to live there because inflation is so high and the conditions are horrible and crime goes up, all externally caused in many ways. And by the way, Maduro's not faultless, and the government of Venezuela is not faultless, but obviously the sanctions, the freezing of assets, and all of these things have helped to destroy its economy, therefore making it impossible for people to live there. And what happens? All of a sudden, we have Venezuelans all over the United States. We didn't have Venezuelans in the United States before that. The only people who left Venezuela after Chavez were the rich assholes who left because they didn't think they'd be able to get their way under the Chavez government. Not all of them, by the way. Venezuelans are wonderful people. I'm not saying all Venezuelans are all rich people or bad or anything like that. But generally speaking, the only people who left Venezuela back then were not necessarily, people who had nothing to contribute to the United States. In fact, most of those people who left because of Chavez voted for Trump and gave him money to get elected. So that's the situation that I think we have to really understand when it comes to something like this. So if MAGA's entire initiative is America for Americans, which I agree with, by the way, control the borders, which I agree with, by the way, make sure we don't have people coming to the United States. Well, then this is the polar opposite of that. This action that we're talking about now, which is another reason that people in the United States should be questioning it and saying, whoa, wait a minute. This flies in the face of your promise, Mr. President. This is just the kind of stuff that we need to talk about and understand, but we never do, and the media never even mentions it. In the United States, the immigration debate is always about, oh, they're taking over this and they're eating cats, et cetera, stupid shit. And it's never a real intelligent geopolitical explanation of the facts. So here's my conversation with Max Blumenthal on this very issue.
I think there's no question that anytime you do these types of things, there's always going to be a backlash. And the backlash, more often than not, is the immigration or emigration to the United States. I mean, this happens over and over again. It kind of bothers me, Max, that never becomes a part of the discussion when it comes to immigration.
Nope.
I never hear people say, yes, we've got a ton of Hondurans here and a ton of Guatemalans here because we started a civil war there that chased people off their land and killed almost 200,000 people. Of course they don't want to live there. They'll go wherever the hell they can go to get out of that place.
They never, ever, even on, left of center, pro-Democratic Party media will never, ever tell you why we keep having all these migration waves. They'll either tell us we either need to just take them in and love them with open arms, or we need to send them to torture centers in El Salvador and humiliate them and denigrate them in the streets. But they'll never give you the context, which is the drug war. That's one of the biggest pieces of context that can be provided that destabilized Mexico. What about NAFTA? Something that Trump capitalized on. NAFTA also destabilized Mexico, destroyed its rural economy, was responsible for a massive migration wave. How about the U.S. propping up leaders like Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, who is a de facto drug lord who's now in a federal prison in Florida? That's why do you think we had so many migrant caravans from Honduras? And now Ecuador has been totally destabilized by cartels. And who's at the top of that cartel? It's the Noboa family, who's shipping cocaine all around the world in their Bonita banana packages, working with the Albanian mafia. That's where the cocaine goes from Europe. And most of the fentanyl and that kind of drug that's poisoning us is coming from the Pacific coast. It's not coming from Venezuela. Everybody knows that, but nobody says that. And so we get no context. And here's what will happen in Venezuela if Marco Rubio gets his way. There will be a invasion of Venezuela after decapitation strikes. There will be, in that case, civil war inside Venezuela, a bloodbath, because the Chavistas will have to fight because they know that, as Maria Corina Machado, the planned U.S. quote unquote governor for the day after, has said, she will violently purge all iterations of Chavismo from Venezuela and will basically be Pinochet in a skirt. Do you think the millions of people who have stood for Chavismo for decades are going to put up with that and let themselves be dragged into prisons and executed? So there's going to be a civil war. But one thing they can't do is they can't do some clean military coup, because the military is with Nicolas Maduro.
Why did they give her the Nobel Peace Prize? Do you think it was, you think they were doing that to take a shot at Trump?
No, I think they were doing that because they wanted regime change in Venezuela and they were trying to give Trump the green light. And if you look at all of the previous Nobel Peace Prizes, or I would call them war prizes, all of them went to, many of them in the past several years, went to U.S. government assets vying for regime change in independent or Russian-aligned or socialist-oriented countries, what we call dissidents. So this was another case. They happened to give the Nobel Peace Prize to Machado, someone who actually signed a formal document of cooperation with ICC wanted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, and then issued a separate letter calling for Netanyahu to invade her own country of Venezuela. So the Nobel Peace Prize has been completely discredited by this award.
So once again, let me just bring you up to date before I close this out. This is Jay Speak. I've always said this to you because I think it's important. It's important to have access. It's important to learn. It's important to go around the world and get different ideas about the things that we have been told. If you live in the West, and especially in the United States, I'm sorry, but you are so loaded with bullshit every day. Our corporate media in the United States, the CBSs, the ABCs, the NBCs, they're so bought and paid for. It's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. What I do here is I'm in Turkey. I was in China. I was in Crimea. I am in Moscow. I am in Istanbul. I am going to different places, talking to different people, because the people on this side of the world are waking up. BRICS is for real. The multipolar world is for real. The global South is for real. And these countries that are coming together they should, if nothing else, even if we don't like them or don't disagree with them, they should be heard. And when you hear them, you start seeing things a little differently in many ways. And maybe this is something we should have done a long time ago, but unfortunately, for me anyway, access is important. You have to be here to talk to these people. You have to be here to understand a different kind of mindset and ideology. So that's what I'm trying to do for you, and I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please give me a like, share this video with people you think might be
real range and firepower, what we are seeing off the coast of Venezuela is precisely that. American naval forces have positioned themselves in a way that leaves little doubt about who controls escalation. Nicolás Maduro, facing a power he cannot match, has responded not with threats, but with a carefully worded plea for peace. That contrast reveals the fundamental asymmetry of the situation. One side speaks from a position of dominance, the other from vulnerability. American strategy has long relied on the visible projection of power to shape political outcomes without the need for direct war. Carrier groups, destroyers, and fast attack vessels are not simply tools of combat. They are instruments of coercion. By sailing close to Venezuelan waters, Washington isn't announcing an invasion. It is announcing capacity, the ability to strike blockade and impose costs at a time and place of its choosing. In this kind of confrontation, the presence of a single carrier strike group is enough to shift the entire balance of regional politics. It signals to the regime in Caracas and to the wider region that the United States remains the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Maduro's reaction is instructive. He chose to go public, calling for peace forever, framing himself as a man resisting aggression. But beneath the rhetoric lies the reality that Venezuela cannot meet force with force. Its naval capabilities are negligible compared to the U.S. fleet. Its air defenses are limited, outdated, and vulnerable to precision strikes. Its economy is in collapse, its alliances uncertain. In a direct contest with the United States, Maduro has no viable military options. His plea is a diplomatic maneuver born of strategic weakness. For Washington, this kind of display is standard practice. It has been a pillar of American grand strategy since the Second World War. Use overwhelming military capacity to shape the behavior of weaker states, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. doesn't need to issue ultimatum. The movement of ships and aircraft does the talking. This strategy is especially effective against regimes that are isolated, economically weak, and dependent on deterrence by rhetoric rather than actual power. Maduro's regime fits that profile perfectly. But this is about more than one man or one regime. It's about how the United States exerts pressure without crossing into open war. Power projection creates what strategists call a coercive environment, the space where the weaker actor is forced to make concessions, scale back ambitions, or negotiate from a position of fear. Washington has mastered this tactic over decades, using it in Latin America, the Persian Gulf, and East Asia. It is warfare without formal war, and it is often more effective than invasion. The anatomy of power projection is simple but brutal. It doesn't rely on persuasion. It relies on presence, capacity, and the knowledge that the United States can escalate at will. Maduro's plea for peace is not the voice of a confident leader. It's the voice of a regime staring at a force it cannot confront, hoping to buy time and space. In this confrontation, one side dictates the tempo, the other reacts. When Nicolás Maduro stood before his people and the world and called for peace, it was not the statement of a confident leader. It was a signal of strategic recognition, an acknowledgement that Venezuela's position in this confrontation is weak, Public pleas like this are often dismissed as political theater, but in power politics, they reveal far more than they conceal. Maduro understands that when a U.S. carrier group positions itself off his coast, his options narrow to almost nothing. He can escalate rhetorically, but not militarily. He can mobilize his domestic base, but that won't stop American precision-guided munitions. His plea is not an offer of negotiation. It is a survival instinct. Washington's move, by contrast, is calculated. It is coercive diplomacy in its purest form. The U.S. does not need to issue ultimatums through diplomatic channels when the presence of naval power communicates the message more effectively. This is a familiar pattern position. Forces make the threat implicit and force the weaker actor to adjust behavior under pressure. The fact that Maduro went public so quickly, emphasizing peace and calling for international mediation, shows how rapidly the pressure took effect. This is how great powers shape outcomes without firing a shot. The psychological component of these actions cannot be overstated. Maduro is a political survivor, not a military strategist. His government is built on domestic control, patronage, and the exploitation of a weakened economy, not on the capacity to confront external threats facing overwhelming American power. His priority is not resistance, but regime preservation. By appealing to the international community, he's attempting to reframe the confrontation as one between a small sovereign state and an imperial aggressor. Is a familiar narrative, but one that does little to change the balance of forces. From Washington's perspective, this is precisely the kind of response it seeks. By forcing Maduro to talk about peace rather than war, the U.S. is dictating the strategic tempo. It's not negotiating from weakness. It's extracting concessions by making inaction appear to be the only rational option. For Caracas, every U.S. naval maneuver amplifies the pressure. Every Maduro statement reinforces his own vulnerability. This dynamic is not accidental. It's a core feature of how the United States uses its military to shape politics abroad. This standoff also exposes a deeper truth about American strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Washington rarely tolerates rival actors or destabilizing regimes in what it considers its strategic backyard. For more than a century, this has been the logic behind interventions and blockades across Latin America. Whether it was Grenada in 1983, Panama in 1989, or naval operations off Cuba and Venezuela, the pattern is the same. The U.S. uses force not because it must, but because it can. Its goal is not always regime change. Sometimes it is simply to remind weaker states where the lines of power truly lie. Maduro's plea is therefore less a diplomatic gesture than a strategic confession. He knows he cannot win a military confrontation with the United States. His only hope is to reframe the crisis in moral or political terms, to cast himself as a victim, hoping to build international pressure that restrains Washington. But power politics doesn't revolve around moral claim. It revolves around capabilities. And in this equation, Venezuela has none that matter. Washington has them all. This is why the U.S. move has already achieved part of its purpose without a single shot being fired. Maduro is on the defensive rhetorically, politically, and strategically, and the world has just been reminded of how little leverage Venezuela truly has when American power comes to bear. When the United States positions a carrier strike group near a foreign coastline, it is not improvisation. It's a deliberate calculation. These deployments are among the most visible and effective tools in Washington's coercive arsenal. A single carrier group represents an entire spectrum of power, naval, air, logistical, and psychological. Its presence is designed to change behavior, not necessarily through combat, but through pressure. This is exactly what is unfolding off the coast of Venezuela. Washington has not declared war, but it has made its intentions unmistakably clear. It holds the advantage, and it intends to use it. Carrier strike groups function as mobile instruments of dominance. A Nimitz-class carrier can launch dozens of aircraft in rapid succession, project power, hundreds of miles inland, and coordinate strikes with precision. Its escort cruiser. Destroyers, submarine, provide air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and surface strike capabilities. When such a formation appears off a nation's coast, the message isn't subtle. It says, we can escalate when we choose, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. For weak or isolated regimes like Maduro's, this kind of signal leaves few viable options other than compliance or symbolic resistance. This form of pressure is not new. Washington has used carrier groups to shape geopolitical outcomes for decades in the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. What makes carriers so effective is their dual nature. They can conduct devastating operations if needed, but their mere presence often achieves strategic goals without a single missile being fired. It's the embodiment of coercive diplomacy, the credible threat of overwhelming force that compels an adversary to alter course. Maduro's regime is acutely aware of this. Venezuela cannot challenge a U.S. carrier group militarily. Its navy is outdated and undersized, its air force under-resourced, and its radar and missile coverage limited. Even its Russian-supplied systems cannot match the speed, coordination, or reach of American forces. This leaves Maduro with only political tools, rhetoric, diplomacy, appeals to international sympathy. That is why his response has been to beg for peace rather than threaten war. He knows the cost of escalation would be catastrophic. For Washington, this is precisely the intended outcome. Carrier groups don't just project power. They create psychological and strategic momentum. They signal to local elites, the military, and the international community that the U.S. is in control of the situation. They also shape the calculus of other actors, whether they are cartels, foreign sponsors like Russia or Iran, or neighboring governments. All of them must now operate under the shadow of American escalation dominance. What's unfolding here is classic American statecraft. The United States doesn't need to topple regimes through large-scale invasions when it can accomplish the same strategic objectives through visible, overwhelming force projection. Carrier groups are not just war machines. They are instruments of political control. In the Venezuelan case, their presence alone is enough to strip Maduro of leverage, isolate him diplomatically, and force him to make choices within a narrow corridor defined by Washington. This is how power works in the real world, not through speeches, not through ideology, through capacity, proximity, and credible threat. A carrier group is the physical embodiment of all three, and Maduro understands painfully what that means. Venezuela today is not simply a weak state facing pressure from a stronger neighbor. It is something more dangerous, a state deeply enmeshed in the operations of transnational criminal network. Over the last decade, the Maduro regime has blurred the line between government and illicit enterprise to a degree rarely seen in modern Latin America. The country has become a critical node in the global drug trade, a sanctuary for organized criminal groups, and a logistical corridor connecting South American production to markets in the United States and Europe. This is why Washington treats Venezuela not just as a political problem, but as a security threat. The presence of U.S. naval forces in the Caribbean is not only about geopolitical posturing, it's about closing off one of the most active trafficking routes in the hemisphere. Maduro's government is at the center of this web. Senior figures in the military, intelligence services, and political apparatus have been implicated in the so-called Cartel of the Suns, a network responsible for facilitating drug shipments through Venezuelan territory. Corruption is systemic, not incidental, and because the state itself has been captured by these interests, conventional diplomacy has limited impact. Washington understands this. It does not treat Maduro as a traditional political adversary, but as a figure presiding over what amounts to a criminalized state. That framing shapes every aspect of American strategy in the region. The deployment of carrier groups and naval assets is therefore part of a broader counter-narcotics campaign. U.S. Southern Command has spent years monitoring Venezuelan airspace, maritime routes, and clandestine trafficking corridors. By positioning naval forces close to Venezuelan waters, Washington can intercept shipments, apply direct pressure on the regime's financial lifelines, and signal to cartels and foreign sponsors alike that the cost of operating under Maduro's umbrella is rising. It is pressure not only aimed at the political leadership, but at the networks that sustain it. Maduro understands this threat. His plea for peace was not simply about avoiding war. It was about protecting the structure of his regime. A U.S. naval blockade or sustained counter-narcotics campaign could cut off vital revenue streams, destabilize internal patronage networks, and accelerate elite fragmentation. His government is not held together by ideological loyalty, but by a shared interest in preserving power and profit. That makes it extremely vulnerable to external pressure of this kind. The U.S. doesn't need to topple the regime militarily. It only needs to weaken the flows that keep it functioning. This dynamic also illustrates a broader feature of U.S. strategy. Washington often targets criminalized states not through occupation, but through maritime dominance and economic strangulation. Similar methods have been used in operations against regimes in Panama, Libya, and parts of West Africa. Naval power allows the United States to act decisively without the political cost of long-term ground intervention. Against Venezuela, isolated, economically devastated, and reliant on illicit networks, this approach is particularly effective. The narco state dilemma is simple regimes that rely on criminal enterprise can survive domestic political crises, but they struggle against sustained external pressure. Maduro's plea for peace is a recognition of that reality.
Been once a paradise of sun and sea is now turning into a flashpoint of global tension. A US guided missile destroyer, the USS Gravely, docks just miles off Venezuela's coast. Within hours, Caracas claims it has foiled a CIA funded false flag attack targeting that very ship. But as if that wasn't enough, US B 1B bombers thunder over Venezuelan skies in a menacing show of power. The question the world is now asking is Washington building a pretext for war against Nicolas Maduro's regime? Welcome back to TFI Global. Let's break it down. On Monday morning, Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello stunned the nation with a fiery announcement. He said security forces had dismantled a CIA financed cell planning to strike the USS Gravely and framed the attack on Venezuela. 4 suspects were reportedly arrested. Details? Sparse. Proof? None. None has been made public yet, but the timing was no coincidence. The USS Gravely had just arrived in Trinidad and Tobago, barely 100 kilometers from Venezuelan shores. Caracas calls it a deliberate provocation, a spark meant to ignite a war in the Caribbean. And the response from President Nicolas Maduro came fast and furious. He announced the suspension of all gas agreements with Trinidad and Tobago, accusing Prime Minister Kamala Persad Bisesar of turning her island nation into an aircraft carrier of the American empire. For months now, the US military has been expanding its footprint in the region. Until President Donald Trump's renewed anti narcotics campaign, 7 warships have been deployed across the Caribbean, one in the Gulf of Mexico, and the USSR Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, is en route. Add to that fighter jets, submarines, and special forces assets. On Monday, the skies themselves joined the chorus. 2B-1B Lancer bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads streaked across the Caribbean, flying parallel to Venezuela's coast before disappearing from radar. It was the third such flyover in recent weeks. First came the B-52 mission earlier this month, then another B-1B sortie, and now this latest demonstration. To Washington, these are routine deterrence patrols. To Caracas, they're warnings of war. Maduro's government insists this isn't about drugs or security, it is about regime change. For years, the US has refused to recognize Maduro's election victories in 2018 and 2024, calling them fraudulent. Sanctions, oil embargoes, and covert pressure have followed. Now, with US bombers in the skies and warships in nearby waters, Caracas claims Washington is fabricating an excuse to invade. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez accused the US and Trinidad of plotting a false flag event, a fake attack designed to justify full scale intervention. She warned that Venezuela will not hesitate to defend its sovereignty. Meanwhile, the US insists its military operations are strictly anti drug missions. But independent analysts have pointed out a disturbing pattern here. Since September, American forces have sunk at least 10 boats allegedly carrying narcotics, killing 43 people, all without independent verification. Critics in Washington itself say the missions may be breaching international law. The crisis has divided the Western Hemisphere. Trinidad's Prime Minister Persad Bisesar rejected Venezuela's accusations of blackmail, calling her country's cooperation with the US legitimate defense coordination. But the rhetoric in Washington is even sharper. US Senator Lindsey Graham said Maduro's days are outnumbered, and Senator Rick Scott went further, warning that Maduro should flee to China or Russia because the US is planning something big. That remark, chillingly ambiguous, has fueled speculation that covert or open US action could be imminent. The CIA, already authorized by Trump to conduct limited operations in Venezuela, has become the center of this storm. If the alleged false flag plot was real, it would represent a dangerous escalation of clandestine warfare in America. Behind all the saber rattling lies another battlefield: energy. Washington recently cleared Trinidad and Tobago to exploit the Dragon gas field, which lies inside Venezuelan waters, despite US sanctions on Caracas. That decision enraged Maduro, who saw it as theft disguised as diplomacy. Analysts say control over regional energy routes and denying Venezuela access to its own gas reserves may be the hidden motive behind this growing confrontation. Trump's administration, facing election pressures, is using Venezuela's crisis to project strength abroad and rally domestic support. But the risks are massive. A single miscalculation, one radar blip, one missile launch could ignite a Caribbean war involving not just the US and Venezuela, but potentially Russia, China, and Cuba, all of whom maintain close military or intelligence ties with Caracas. So, where does this all lead? Venezuela claims it stopped a CIA false flag while the US insists it's fighting cartels. Trinidad finds itself caught between two giants, its ally America and its neighbor Venezuela. And in the skies above, the bombers keep circling. If history teaches us anything, it's that great powers often stumble into wars they never meant to start. And right now, the Caribbean looks like a powder keg, one false move away from explosion. As the USS gravely floats within sight of Venezuelan shores and US bombers shadow the horizon, the world watches and waits. Because what happens next could decide not just Venezuela's fate, but the balance of power between the entire Western Hemisphere. If you found this deep dive informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more geopolitical development. Thanks for watching.
Amid escalating tensions with Russia and the United States and Venezuela, Russia and Venezuela are causing up. President Putin has signed a document elevating Moscow's strategic partnership with Caracas. This agreement, initiated by Russia, not only strengthens bilateral cooperation between the two nations in political and economic spheres, but also energy, mineral extraction, transport and communications, and more importantly, in security, counterterrorism aspects. The agreement empowers both Russia and Venezuela to fight against unilateral sanctions. This brings both nations together as they both face US sanctions. A number of Russian companies have already entered the Venezuelan energy sector through Russian giant Rosneft that has been recently sanctioned by the United States. Venezuela's state-owned oil and gas company, PDVSA, sanctioned by the US, is working with the Russian oil companies in the field of personnel training. Moscow supplies to Venezuela industrial equipment, automobiles, pulp, fertilizers, and other chemical products, and in return buys items such as rum, fruits, and cocoa, as well as marble and granite. So has the ratification of Russia-Venezuela strategic ties also solidified their military cooperation? Although Venezuela has significant reserves of modern Russian-made weapons, the legislation does not allow the possibility of deploying foreign military bases in the country. Secondly, the new treaty is not similar to Russia's defense pact with North Korea, which states that if there is a direct threat of armed intervention, the parties will immediately begin negotiations on joint actions. Article 14 of the Russia-Venezuela Treaty urges the parties to undertake and improve ties in the field of defense, carry out military technical cooperation in the interests of strengthening the defense capability and ensuring the security of the two countries. The strategic elevation between the two countries comes at the backdrop of Venezuela's soaring tensions with the US. On Sunday, the USS Gravely, a guided missile destroyer, docked in the Trinidadian capital, Port of Spain, on a 4-day visit. The U.S. warship will hold drills in the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force. Venezuela has called the move a military provocation conducted by the CIA. Trinidad and Tobago is situated just 11 kilometers from the Venezuelan coast. The ship's arrival comes amid a mounting military campaign by U.S. President Donald Trump against alleged drug traffickers in Latin America, which has largely targeted Venezuelan and so far been limited to deadly strikes in international waters. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has repeatedly claimed that the South American country is well armed with Russian weapons. Maduro says Venezuela owns at least 5,000 Russian anti-aircraft missiles to counter U.S. forces. Venezuela has Russian-made Igla-S short-range missiles that form a key component of the country's air defense network. The question remains, given the strategic elevation of ties between Russia and Venezuela, apart from Russian munitions, will Russian troops fight for Venezuela? Let's ask that question to our guest, Diego Sequeira, who is a journalist and political analyst, is now works in the independent Mission Verdad outlet. Is now joining us from Caracas, Venezuela. Mr. Diego Sequeira, thank you very much for making time for us. The fine print for this is not out yet, and I'm talking about the agreement between Russia and Venezuela. The engagement has been ongoing between the two already for a very long time. Do you actually think that Russia will fight for Venezuela against the United States?
I actually don't think that's part of that is contemplated within the agreement, which is, yes, an expansion, and it deepens all these areas of cooperation even further. This kind of, well, you already reviewed it properly, but this kind of agreement, it's very specific and very strategic, and a few countries in the world have it, like with its nuances, be it Korea, North Korea, Belarus, or Iran, and China. But I don't think within the fine print, of course, this is going to be one of the possibilities. I think even in military terms and geographical terms, it's even counterproductive. This, of course, doesn't mean that we're not going to have some sort of support, especially on the technical level, as it already has been seen, although most of the details, of course, are confidential regarding defense and security. So it's not easy to also to like state where, 100% any of these aspects.
Mr. Sequeira, putting aside this agreement between Russia and Venezuela, let's talk about what is happening in the international waters. And I'm talking about the drug trafficking and the U.S. involvement in bombing some of these boats. How is Nicolas Maduro going to deal with this so-called American efforts in international waters going forward?
It is a work in progress, and as we can see, we have like two very visible elements right now. One, regardless of the possibilities of the threats, there's a psychological and political pressure component, which is a more candid one, the more visible one, which, according to what it happens, the government will react and will adapt to the situation. And the other element, which I think is even more sensitive on the short term, is the expansion of this gray area of extrajudicial killings to the wider Caribbean. We've already seen how there are also Colombian victims. We're already seen also how politically Colombia's president it's at the crosshairs of the United States right now. We see that now they're interested in engaging in regime change efforts both in Venezuela and Caracas, which is the actual nature of this. This is completely counterfactual the way they are actually engaging and facing the threat, let's call it threat of drug trafficking. It's completely against what the data says. It's completely against what the actual serious reports, including DEA report, says. So this goes further. This is about regime change. And actually, the other thing is that basically, I think the U.S. doesn't concern. Has no concern about the truth at this point.
Yesterday, Russia launched their Burevestnik nuclear missile, and so many people are talking about the significance of Russia launching their nuclear weapons or testing their nuclear weapons at this moment. And now we have this pact being signed between Russia and Venezuela. My question to you is, do you think Russia is moving towards a more sort of war cooperation pact with other nations pitting against the United States?
Well, to the extent that this is within the frame, within a different political framework, of course, this also shows the kind of approach that Russia and also in their own ways, Iran or China has regarding their own partners. And in that sense, I think it's just a deepening, especially on key areas and with key partners like Venezuela in this case. Regarding the test we saw yesterday, it also relates to the U.S. endeavor right now, not only regarding Venezuela, of course, but also how they are also engaging on two levels, a public one and a more ambiguous one regarding Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And not only Ukraine, we also see how they've got pressuring now China, they're also pressuring India. The difference is in the case of Russia specifically is that it has the war with the Ukraine in the middle of it all, and also the urgency of Trump to have like a political win in some area. But I don't know how successful this is going to be if you're going to actually sanction their oil industry, the thing they did a few days ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to do with the dynamic that the U.S. Trump administration is setting up across the world, be it Venezuela, be it India, be it the People's Republic of China with tariffs, or be it Russia with sanction pressure.
All right. Mr. Diego Sequeira, thank you for all your time and for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Kofi, follow me.